Hello there, my name is Nils with Learn to DIY, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to build this awfully good looking ocean themed standing desk. Now if you're new to the Learn to DIY channel, Learn to DIY is all about helping you to feel empowered to do things yourself. That includes everything from building desks like this, to general home improvements, to repairs around the house. So if that's your thing and you want to keep up with what we're working on, then feel free to hit that subscribe button below.
So here was my challenge. I wanted to create this awesome desktop to go with my standing desk base, but look at these things. I mean, these are incredible. This French guy from the Caribbean makes these amazing tables, and they cost $12,000 to $60,000, and they're just gorgeous, but they must cost an arm and a leg to create. So I thought, let me try my own version of this. I'm going to do something, and my son actually gave me the idea. He said, "Dad, why don't you take some plywood and just layer them on top of each other to get that layered look?" So I went into Photoshop, did a little drawing, and then started tracing my drawing, adding up the layers one at a time until I eventually came out with a prototype that I was actually pretty happy with the look of. So this is what I came out with, and then I thought, alright, now I've got to make this thing real. So how do we put this together and make it happen? So here was the idea. I take each of these pieces and I cut them out of plywood, maybe different thicknesses of plywood, with each piece getting a little bit larger than the piece on top of it. And then I stack them all on top of each other, like this. Once I've got them all stacked, then I can die each layer and then put glass pieces all around it to make for a nice smooth tabletop. So that was the vision. So to get started with this process, I started by grabbing multiple sheets of plywood. I got some 1/2-inch plywood as well as some 1/4-inch plywood, and then I ripped it down to where the left side was about 2 feet and the right side was about 3 feet, which gave me just enough material to work with the shapes that I had created in my design. Now this gave me a nice stack of wood to start with, and once I verified that everything looked good, I took that into the house, and then I used a technique which I had seen elsewhere where I take a projector and I project an image of what each layer should look like onto the plywood, and there I can trace it. Now I had this little tiny projector that it can actually connect to my phone wirelessly, so I could swipe through the different images and then just trace right onto the wood itself. So I went through each layer one by one and took my time to make sure I got a nice mark there. I made sure to do this with pencil, and this will make more sense in just a few minutes when I show you that we actually have to erase the top layer. So I started with this, went through each one, and then I knew exactly where to cut out for all of the different layers of the desk. Now with all my layers marked, I grabbed some 2.5mm replacement glass. These are pretty big sheets, they're about 2.5 by 3 foot, and I decided I would take 2 thicknesses of these and create my inset using these 2 sheets of glass put together. So I traced everything using a Sharpie, and then I started making my cuts. And at first it actually went pretty well. These were a lot of curves, and I had done some cutting of glass before, but mostly just straight lines. So as I was working on these curves, the first couple came out okay, and then you'll see it didn't go so well after just a little bit.
Oh yeah. No! Oh, wow. Oh.
And eventually I reached this point.
Wow, I stink. I did such a bad job at trying to cut that. Lesson learned, you know. I'm gonna try something now that I think is a lot more approachable and definitely gonna be a lot easier for anybody watching at home to try out too. We're gonna work with acrylic. So this stuff is pretty cool for a couple of reasons. The number one reason is that you can use your regular woodworking tools to cut and shape this. I'm gonna be using a combination probably of the jigsaw and the bandsaw to do this. So the pieces I've got here are 0.22 inches thick. So that's just shy of a 1/4 inch, and they're pretty sturdy. So I'm still gonna have them inset into my little multi-layered ocean scene here, so I think it'll work out pretty well. But I'm gonna use my regular tools and take a crack at this. So, well, not take a crack. I'm gonna give it a go. So let's do this.
Now just like with the glass, I had to start out by tracing the shape of the lines onto the acrylic itself. So once I had that on there, I used a jigsaw, and I made sure to use a jigsaw with a specific blade on here. I had a 12 TPI Bosch blade. I'll put a link in the description for what that blade is. And the key here is to move slowly. If you move too fast with the blade, what's going to happen is it's going to start to gum up, and it's actually going to melt behind the blade, and then it seals itself back together, so it doesn't even actually break off. It just cuts it and then reseals itself back up. So make sure to move pretty slowly with the jigsaw.
Now what you end up with is a nice clean line, just like you would hope for. Now that we have our pieces cut out, I need to clean up the edges, and I've got a pretty clean edge on most of these. It actually came out really nicely, but when I was kind of figuring out how to do things a little bit, I got some rough spots. So what I'm going to do is I've just got a little drum sander on the end of my drill bit here, and I'm going to use my drill to actually clean up these edges. They don't need to be perfect, they're going to be butted up against a layer of wood, but I want them to look clean and decent and not have jagged spots or spots around the faces or the surfaces of the acrylic that will prevent them from sitting flushly into the tabletop. So at this point, we've got all of the edges of the acrylic cleaned up and looking really good. So the next step is to transfer the lines of the exact cutout. We already have lines on our plywood here, but I want to make sure that lines match up exactly with our cuts, because there are going to be some discrepancies. It's going to be a little bit off, so I want to make sure that we get this spot on so that there's a nice tight fit. I think the easiest way is going to be just to use the existing cut we have, a good sharp tip on a pencil, trace that, and then make my cuts from there. How long are your arms?
Not so long.
Only to there. All right, I'll do this part up here. There. Look at that. All right, I'm pleased with that. That is a nice tight fit all the way around. Okay, so this method is working well, so I'm gonna keep going with this. Whoa, I like it. That is awesome. All right.
Now with the top layer knocked out, I was able to work on the second, third, and fourth layers. So I just followed the lines that I had created from my projection and cut out all of the different shapes until they were all ready to stack on top of one another and ready to move on to my next step, which is dyeing. Now with the dye, I found that RIT all-purpose dye was definitely the dye to use. There are different dyes out there. I actually tried some that was more of a powder-based, and it was a total failure. So when I tried this, it worked really well. I just used a combination of the straight-up dye itself and then some diluted with water layers, and that worked out really well. So I used aquamarine and royal blue, and I made sure to keep track of the order that I had these in so that it was consistent on all of the different pieces. Now I started out, before I did any dye, by tracing each layer onto the layer below it. That gave me a thin pencil line to work with, so I didn't have to put too much dye all around. I knew exactly how much I needed to cover. So after removing all of the debris and dust from the different layers, I started with a fairly decent brush, and then just work your way through the dye on each of the layers. So just a couple of things to keep in mind when you're doing the dyeing of the different layers. It's important that you dye the edges, the actual plies that are showing through on the end grain, just as well as you do the surfaces. Those are going to be very visible, and you want to make sure that those look just as good as everything else. Also, I would recommend that you do not dye the outsides. You're probably going to sand those off anyways, so just do the inside layers, not the outside square of the table.
All right, I am really loving the way this thing is turning out. So it's got a really cool look to it. I think it's pretty unique. Definitely digging this. So next up, I'm going to glue. So I'm not going to glue any of these layers to the bottom layer. I'm just going to glue them to each other. These top 4 layers here are going to be glued to one another. And that way, when I need to fit the acrylic in, all these other pieces can kind of move around and fit tight into the acrylic. Make sure I've got a good, nice, tight fit there. And then I will glue them down to the bottom board as well. So that's where we'll get to at this point.
With those top few layers glued together, I turned everything upside down and placed all of the acrylic down first on the table, and was basically going to build this thing from the bottom up. The reason I did this is I wanted to make sure the acrylic and then the top layer all fit nice and snug together, and then I would attach the bottom layer or the base layer to those, knowing that everything fits snugly. I used some 1¼ screws, making sure to pre-drill everything, and I also made sure to stick with just the areas that were the full height. Didn't want to have any screws piercing through any of the layers. From there, I used some Minwax Natural 209 finish and put a pretty hefty coat on the top layer, and then actually finished all of the other layers at the same time. Then I went back and put a second coat on that top layer. This gave a nice protection to everything and kept everything looking really nice and had a nice little shine. It kind of popped the colors a little bit when I was done with it as well. Now, one of my last steps was to get all of my outside edge acrylic pieces cut. This was a little tricky, so what I decided to try was I took some scrap pieces that had a flat edge, and then I traced what the shape of those would be. I then took that and transferred it to acrylic, traced it out, and then I used a metal yardstick as a straight edge, and then I used a plastic cutting knife. What this essentially does is scores it about halfway through after several passes, and then allows you to snap it off, and then you can use a jigsaw to cut out the various steps that go inside there. Alright, so we're getting towards the final steps here, and unless everything was cut exactly perfectly, you're probably going to want to use a belt sander to get everything nice and straight. What this does is evens out all of the plywood layers, and then if you leave the acrylic in, it will actually even those out at the same time. The other thing that this does is allows you to go through all of the different grits and get that edge nice and smooth. I ran from about 60 grit up to 220. At this point, it was time for some cleanup, so I used my air compressor to blow all the dust and debris off of everything, got everything as smooth as I could, and then made sure to do one last pass at the edges of the acrylic. With that, I used some glass cleaner to clean very well both the inside and the outside of the acrylic. You want to make sure that everything looks perfect here. If you have any dust or debris stuck in there, it's going to be in there forever. Then I used a 100% silicone sealant to create that bond between the wood layers and the acrylic. And it worked really well. One thing that I would do a little bit differently were I to do this again is that I would actually use a smaller cut on the actual end of the nozzle so that I could get a smaller and maybe more controlled bead. Got a little crazy with it in some places and it ended up being a little bit sloppy, but fortunately I did at least have the wisdom to start in the back of the desk so that the front came out pretty good by that point. And at long last, there it is.
I want to take just a minute to thank the sponsor for today's video, Anthrodesk. Anthrodesk has actually been super great to work with. They're really interested in helping people get into standing desks for the health benefits of it. They produce all kinds of different desks, whether it's just the base like what I use, so if you're a DIYer and want to create your own desktop like this, they're a perfect fit for that. This desk cost about $300. It's got 4 different memory settings, and you can adjust anywhere in between and have it memorize where I sit and, for example, where my son sits or my wife sits and stands and their heights and that sort of thing. Very versatile and very sturdy. They are the #1 Canadian brand for sit-to-stand desks, and they also have a bunch of cool desks that have nice tops on them in different sizes and even single motor and dual motor options. So definitely something you want to check out. Another thing that I really dig about Anthrodesk is that they actually have some pretty cool accessories for standing desks. They've got, for example, this nice PC tower case that you can mount right to the desk. That's what I use. It's actually height adjustable and width adjustable, so that's pretty sweet. And then there's also this mat, and I've had probably 4 different mats so far that I've used while standing at my desk, and I have to say by far this is the most comfortable and the least likely to bottom out. So right about there. Now this project was a real labor of love. I mean, it took me several months actually to get through the whole process and to figure things out a lot of failures and a lot of learning what doesn't work just so that I could figure out what does. But I'm really happy with the result. If you want to give something like this a try, I've tried my best to make it easy for you. So if you head on over to my website, I've got an article on learntodiy.com where you can find the plans for this desk. I've got all of the different layers that you can print out and paste basically onto the different layers of plywood and create that yourself, or you can just, if you have a little projector or can borrow a projector, you can project them right on like I did. So I've got all of those there, all the dimensions and everything you need. I've also got links to all the products that I used, both in the description below and on the article on the website. So you'll definitely want to go check those out. I've got tons of other videos that you're welcome to take a look at as well on the channel, and articles to match on the website. Now, if you're into social media, if you're on Instagram or Facebook especially, I do post a lot more regularly than I post on my YouTube channel to those different social media accounts. Just quick little updates. For example, I showed several previews of how this desk was coming along as I was building it. So you can check things like that out and follow me on either Instagram or Facebook. Anyway, that's it. Stick around for more videos, and thank you so much for watching. You guys rock, and we'll see you next time.